Hi, everybody. My name is Professor Ryan Scannell. I'm an associate professor in the English and Comparative Literature Department at San Jose State University. On the original Hybrid University Scholar Series presentation was held on September 22nd, 2001. But due to campus-wide internet connectivity issue, we experienced frequent disruption to the virtual connection. So this is a re-recording of my original presentation, including questions that were asked in person and via Zoom. Before I get started, we'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement.
While we gather at San Jose State University, we are gathered on the ethno-historic tribal territory of Tiatmen Ohlone, who were direct ancestors of the lineages enrolled in the Muwekma Ohlone tribe, and who were missionized into Mission Santa Clara, San Jose, and Dolores, the lands on which San Jose State University is established and continues to be of significance to the Muwekma Ohlone tribe. We also recognize that the ancestors of the Muwekma Ohlone constructed and maintained the 3 Bay Area missions. Our campus extends to surrounding areas that held Tupentaka Traditional Roadhouse, which were once located at the historic Lope Ñigo Nangran Rancho Pozolmi y Positas de las Animas, Little Wells of Souls, and also Marcelo Pio and Cristobal's land grant Rancho Ulistac, which were places of celebration and religious ceremonies, as well as nearby ancestral heritage shell mounds that served as the tribe's traditional cemetery sites and territorial monuments. San Jose State University also desires to honor the military service of the Muwekma men and women who have honorably served overseas during World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, Desert Storm, Iraq, and who are still serving in the United Armed Forces today. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. So now I'm going to share my screen. And I'll begin. So thanks again. I wanted to thank Provost Del Casino for the invitation and for the kind intro that he gave on September 22nd. He wasn't able to make it today to give it again, but you'll just have to take my word for it that it was a really good intro. I also want to thank Leslie Seacrest, Mariah Ramser, Melanie Schlitzkes, and the rest of their team for all the work they did to make this function, and also for the additional effort they put in to get the re-recording arranged. So I hope you'll bear with me. I know that previous presenters have spoken extemporaneously from their slides, but I've written things down because frankly, the group of people who gathered on the 22nd were intimidating to me and I was anxious, and I don't want you, as somebody who may be watching this later on, to miss the opportunity to see me anxious and intimidated. I'm also working with some kind of potentially provocative material, so I want to make sure that I do it carefully, which is why I have a script. The irony of me relying on a script will be even funnier as the presentation goes on. But in any case, I do, and I'm going to try very hard not to get sucked into droning. I'm definitely not planning to drown. I try not to get sucked into droning. If I do, either drown or drone, I apologize. My central concern today is this. 20th century fascist leaders, 6 of whom are represented in this slide, so Mussolini, Hitler, and others, were notorious liars. They lied about big things and about little things. They told obvious lies to people who knew they were lying, and yet millions of people trusted them. They built that trust over time, even when they lied openly and egregiously. That trust turned into large-scale support, and that support eventually landed some of them in power. And even in places where fascists didn't come to power, in France and Britain and the US, for example, there were significant, powerful fascist movements in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. And in fact, there still are. In many cases, fascists and neo-fascists continue to enjoy a reputation for being honest, trustworthy, and straightforward, despite ever-mounting evidence that they traffic constantly in misinformation, disinformation, and outright lies. So my goal today is to explain why. In good and faithful academic fashion, I'll begin with some brief-ish definitions. The first is of rhetoric. Rhetoric itself, the word is more than 2 millennia old, and many of the concepts that it names are even older than that, or rather get sucked into the different arguments about what it means. I'm just going to use the definition that I have here on the slide, which is language or symbols that people use to persuade one another to think, believe, and act in certain ways. And if I'm being honest, today I'm really only going to talk about language, not so much the symbols, even though fascist symbols are fascinating in their own right. So working from this definition, rhetoric obviously refers to like campaign speeches, for example, which are overtly rhetorical in that they try and persuade people to vote in a certain way. But at the same time, a website's back-end infrastructure is also rhetorical, albeit covertly, in that it encourages certain kinds of user behavior. It persuades people to engage with websites in certain ways. So for example, on Facebook, you are encouraged to like things, and on Twitter, you're encouraged to share things. And that is a sort of persuasive activity encouraged by the website infrastructure itself. Even the choice of an associate professor talking about fascist rhetoric, deciding to wear a Hawaiian shirt in his re-recording of his presentation is rhetorical in that it encourages people who are watching this to view me in a particular way, somebody who's fun-loving and also brilliant at the same time, right? Don't forget that. And people like me, rhetoric scholars, study the complex ways that people use persuasion in real ways in the real world. I know I'm probably already too much in the weeds here, but as I said, there are conflicting definitions of rhetoric, and I want to make sure you know where I stand in relation to rhetoric to understand what I have to say about fascist rhetoric. You also need to know how I'm planning to define fascism. If you know anything about research or scholarship on fascism, if you've ever read any of it, then you know that the definitions of fascism are bitterly disputed, and they've only become more bitterly disputed in recent years. Again, I'm not planning to get sucked into the debates, but I do need to at least narrow what I'm talking about, because the term exists in a wide field which ranges from hopelessly expansive to suffocatingly narrow. For an example of the former, we can look at a recent episode of The Daily Show with correspondent Jordan Klepper, in which he went out and interviewed several anti-vaccination activists about COVID mandates. One of the interviewees that Klepper talked to, he asked whether mandates were communist or fascist, and she said both. And then she pivoted and compared them to the Holocaust. So for that person, fascist doesn't have a specific historical referent. It means anything she dislikes. And that's, common usage for anybody who's been on the internet will be familiar with. At the other end of the spectrum, there are people who study fascism who maintain unnecessarily strict standards for what counts as fascist. It has to be consistently ideological, politically coherent, and ideally interwar European. Some people, including German journalist Sebastian Hafner, have argued that even Nazis weren't fascists and that, quote, Hitler was nearer to Stalin than to Mussolini. And there are better and worse versions of that argument. But since Hitler modeled the Nazi Party on Mussolini's fascists, it's not really defensible in its most extreme formulation. So rather than try and figure out a definition of generic fascism, a elusive set of characteristics based on ideology or goals or style or hatreds or whatever, I'm inclined to take the rhetorical view that fascism gets played out in language and symbols. More to the point here, I'm inclined to take fascists at their word. So within my definition, I include people and groups who identified themselves as fascists and or identified themselves with movements associated with fascism, including the Nazis. In America, we had America First and the Christian Front in the 1920s and 30s and 40s. And in Brazil, there's the Ação Integralista Brasileira. And I don't want to be the one to take away their claim to fascism. So with those definitions in place, we can turn to my main concern, which is truth. In the origins of totalitarianism, one of the great chroniclers and philosophers of totalitarianism, Hannah Arendt, argues the following, quote, "The ideal subject of totalitarian rule is not the convinced Nazi or the convinced communist, but people for whom the distinction between fact and fiction and the distinction between true and false no longer exists," end quote. So the question at hand is this: how does a fascist leader persuade followers that the distinction between fact and fiction, true and false, no longer exists? Whereas most scholars of fascism proceeded on the presumption that fascist leaders tricked their constituents into believing falsehoods, and that the trick was accomplished primarily by repeating lies, I'm going to argue otherwise. The people who throw their lots in with fascists are not stupid, uneducated sheep. They are not, for the most part, evil, conniving devils. They are not, for the most part, tricked or hypnotized. They are rather ordinary people seeking stability, safety, and prosperity in uncertain times. And fascists have proven really adept at convincing those people that fascism is the best way to achieve those goals. Even if fascism is kind of not itself desirable, it can nevertheless help them reach goals that they think are important. And that's why fascists are frightening. They're able to persuade, quote unquote, normal people to follow them. The way that they do this is with rhetoric, again, language and symbols. More specifically, fascist rhetorics exploit an inherent instability in liberal democracies, which has to do with an apparent incompatibility between empirical truth on the one hand, factual truth or fact-based truth, and democratic compromise on the other. So I'll come back to that in a little bit, but for now, it's important to note that by exploiting this apparent incompatibility between truth and compromise, fascists are able to amplify authenticity and sincerity as more stable than either facts or democracy, and that's crucial. Consequently, a key aspect of fascist rhetoric is that truth is located in a speaker's performance of sincerity, a performance that can be persuasive even when the speaker is lying, and even when the audience knows the speaker is lying. 20th century fascists were renowned for their lies. Propaganda, misinformation, and disinformation, and outright fabrication were powerful tools in the ascension of fascism after World War I. They continue to be basic instruments of fascist and neo-fascist politics to this day. And in pointing this out, not unreasonably, many scholars imply that fascists just had no regard for truth, that they were Machiavellian. But that's not the case that fascists rejected truth outright. Rather, fascist truth was based on different premises than factual truth or fact-based truth. And it's critical to distinguish these two truths if we want to understand how fascists found popular support for their views. Whereas non-fascists and anti-fascists often hew to facts and relationality as the basis of truth, and never more so than when they're trying to prove that fascists are liars, obviously. Fascists have always taken a more promiscuous view of truth's essential ingredients. It's a question of evidence. Leading scholars in fascism studies, including Robert Paxson, Federico Finkelstein, and Jason Stanley, argue that for fascists, truth was not necessarily bound to empirical evidence. It was bound to whatever supported fascist successes. If you're God's chosen people, if you're pure and righteous and predestined, what can a few eggheads cooking chemicals over a Bunsen burner tell you about the truth? Truth was what fascists said it was, because it affirmed their intuitive beliefs about the world, and especially about themselves and their natural superiority. We'll come back to that below. By contrast, we have what might be called Enlightenment truth or fact-based truth. One of 20th century fascism's defining qualities was an open assault on the Enlightenment values of empiricism, skepticism, and rationality. I'm not planning to get into the weeds of the Enlightenment. I know people keep coming up to me and saying, can you please get into the weeds of the Enlightenment? But I'm going to resist again. Suffice to say here, empiricism, skepticism, and rationality are the cornerstones of truth in all post-Enlightenment liberal democracies. It's the basis of science and legislation and justice and so on, at least in theory, if not always in practice. But empiricism, skepticism, and rationality are complicated values in democracies, and as such, they're always open to criticism and the subject of some discontent and disillusionment. The problem, it's nicely encapsulated in the commonplace that politicians lie. There's a not totally unreasonable assumption that politicians are a good deal worse than everyone else, maybe with the exception of lawyers. My apologies to lawyers if you're watching. The reason for this conventional wisdom about politicians is that in matters of governance, practicality is often at odds with certainty, which is to say nothing of the assumption of compromise, moral compromise that it takes to get elected in the first place. So on the one hand, we've got scientific, empirical, fact-based truth. On the other hand, democracies are built fundamentally on argument, deliberation, and compromise. So the two are not incompatible if you take for granted that fact-based truth is filtered through human frailty. Enlightenment philosophers knew that. They knew that truth is based on perspectives, and there's no single truth that everybody can ever agree to. Scientists know the same. Truth is based on evidence and facts, but there's no specific truth, no singular truth, no religious or God-based truth that we ever get to, at least according to Enlightenment philosophers. Moreover, whatever the supposed truth, even of empirical evidence, its consequences are differentially experienced by different people in different circumstances with different perspectives, all of which can be simultaneously true and legitimate. So the example that I gave in my talk on the 22nd was gas taxes in California. How people experience those gas taxes, which are some of the highest in the nation, are very different from somebody who lives, say, in San Francisco, in a big city and travels a lot on those roads versus somebody who lives in a farm community and doesn't really see the benefits of a lot of the road repair, for example, that those taxes go to. There's no empirical solution to resolve human difference. And again, Enlightenment scholars knew that, Enlightenment philosophers knew that. Therefore, by definition, democracy requires reason and compromise to negotiate the handling of empirical truth. In the process of compromise, ideally everyone gets something they want, but nobody gets everything they want. But compromise is at least superficially inconsistent with grounded definitions of empirical truth. If a thing is truly true, it should not be compromised. If it can be compromised, it cannot truly be true, right? Enter the fascists. So the apparent paradox of Enlightenment truth and democratic compromise is ripe for critique, and the fascists obliged. Hitler, for example, asserted in 1932 that, quote, "one cannot require heroism from a nation when its political leaders are ready to make any, even the cheapest compromise," end quote. It's a theme he returned to again and again. For Hitler, democracy cultivated weakness because political parties essentially would give up any of their ideological beliefs in order to carve out a space at the table in order to keep themselves in power. And they made compromises, which meant that nobody ever had to take responsibility for their own decisions. And so it was fundamentally democracy, compromise, fundamentally corrupt. Other fascists felt similarly. In their withering critiques of democratic parliamentarianism, fascists often characterized politicians as venal careerists, babbling imbeciles, shameless self-dealers, and feckless cowards. Any of those phrases can be found applied to lots of politicians at any time in history. And to the fascists, democratic parliamentarians, their cravenness emanated directly from the paradoxes of democracy. The valuing of multiple perspectives, compromise, and deliberation were fundamentally corrupt and fundamentally untruthful. And despite those contradictions, Enlightenment truth, which is to say fact-based truth, truth based on the best evidence we have at the time, is still the main gauge of legitimacy in healthy democratic political systems. But in ailing and failing democracies, as fascists have amply demonstrated in both distant and recent history, empirical truth can quickly be made to look like thin gruel. 20th century fascists, including Mussolini, Hitler, and Corneliu Codreanu from Romania, contended that the only empirical truth worth adhering to was the social Darwinian principle of struggle. In short, the strong should dominate and, if necessary, annihilate the weak. All other empirical truths were negotiable. Of course, rejecting empirical truth doesn't necessarily mean rejecting truth altogether. In fact, it's a process of replacement. You can't just destroy empirical truth and hope then to rise into power, because nobody believes in truth at all. Instead, attacking empirical truth is only effective if there's something to replace it. So in place of fact-based truth, then, fascists cleaved to a felt intuitive sense of truth, which may or may not include facts or empirical truth, depending on the needs of the moment, but always was sort of built into this sense of it must be true. It seems obviously true, right? This felt sense of truth became the basis for fascist recruitment, organization, adherence, and control. And history has shown, obviously, that it can have disastrous consequences, which is why it is so important to understand. There are three important interconnected components of fascist truth: the transhistorical myth, leadership principle, and authenticity. Like empiricism, skepticism, and rationalism in the Enlightenment, none of these three components are unique inventions of the fascists, but their combination is the cornerstone of fascist truth, from which it derives its persuasive power. The first component of fascist truth is transhistorical myth, also known as palingenesis. Fascist truth is indexed to the needs or the desires of a chosen people, who are figured in fascist rhetoric as descendants and inheritors of a glorious transhistorical myth. And anybody who's not them is an enemy of that myth, and anybody who's seeking compromise, democracy, parliamentarianism is systematically attacking their grand inherited glory. The Italian fascists, for example, had the Roman legions. The Third Reich had the first two Reichs that dated back to the Holy Roman Empire. And in Romania, the Iron Guard aligned themselves with early Christians. In short, the people were chosen in a mythic past, and people in the present are deeply nostalgic for their glory. As such, they're reclaiming their mythic legacy, almost always with a major element of mythical purity that they have to protect from being extinguished by the barbarian hordes. One reason this historical vision is so persuasive is because it's never the pure invention of the fascist leader. Rather, it's a kind of story that every nation develops, including in liberal democracies, and crucially, often reinforced by fascism's opponents. Fascists simplify and purify old jingoistic myths, which then can touch on often arms race over who's a real citizen, and everybody engages in it. What does it mean to really be a German? What does it mean to really be an Italian? Fascism's mythic past, of course, is pure myth, but it provides coherence and direction and familiarity in a world that's becoming unanchored from empirical truth. The second component of fascist truth is the leadership principle, which Hitler famously defined in the 1920s as unconditional authority downwards and responsibility upwards. In theory, fascist leaders emerge from the masses as the best representatives of their collective beliefs and desires. In practice, the leadership principle results from a charismatic leader taking charge and installing himself, almost always himself, as the source of all truth through whatever means necessary, violence, persuasion, speeches. Here's where the big lie comes into the mix. In one of the most commonly cited passages in Mein Kampf, Hitler ruminated on the concept of the big lie, which, quote, proceeded on the sound principle that the magnitude of a lie always contains a certain factor of credibility, end quote. Lie big, people will believe that there's at least some truth, no matter how, the bigger the lie, the more likely they are to believe that there's some truth. In effect, the charismatic leader proves the feebleness of democracy by being immune to its assumptions. You lie big, you resist shame, and then you rebuke the liberals and the Democrats and parliamentarians for not upholding their own values relative to freedom of speech or tolerance of opposing views. The charismatic leader proves themselves worthy of leading by conspicuously exploiting democracy's weaknesses for everyone to see. The leader then provides focus in fascist movements, not necessarily in what they say, but in their provocative exertions of power that emphasize democracy's inherent contradictions and uncertainties and offer the leader's consistency as the only real remedy. The third, and most rhetorically interesting, at least to me, component of fascist truth is authenticity, which derives directly from the transhistorical myth and the leadership principle. In circumstances where empirical, fact-based truth is attacked and eroded, and when it's primed to be replaced by palingenetic myths and charismatic leaders, fascist believers and potential recruits still have to have some basis for deciding who the leader should be and what myth they should subscribe to. In fascist rhetoric, as I've been arguing, truth does not necessarily derive from facts. That's not the most important kind of evidence, right? It doesn't derive from facts, empiricism, or rational deduction necessarily. In its place, the predominant gauge of truth, the predominant evidence for truth, is authenticity, which emanates from the true leader's will, commitment, and action. They feel things in their gut, right? Like, I know this is true because I feel that it's true. You got to trust your gut. They have these intuitions. They've been spoken to perhaps by God, or they were given a vision. In any case, their commitment and their action and their will is what demonstrates authenticity. They know what's right without a bunch of hair-splitting academics and experts telling them what's what. Authenticity is the barometer of ultimate truth in fascist politics. As such, displays of authenticity and its proxies, sincerity, conviction, genuineness, fanaticism, are the only grounds for determining the true leader. Fascist infidelity to factual truth should have destroyed their political credibility in a democracy, and many of their critics wondered why it didn't. And the reason was that they appeared to be authentic even when they were lying, and even when people knew they were lying. So again, Hitler offers us a particularly good example. I'm writing a book on Hitler, which is why most of my examples are from Hitler. Before he was executed for war crimes in 1946, Hans Frank, he was head of the general government in Poland during World War II and administrator of some of the most horrific atrocities of the Holocaust, said this of Hitler, quote, "The first thing you felt was that here was someone who meant what he said, who didn't want to convince you of anything he didn't believe entirely himself. He spoke from the bottom of his own soul and all of our souls," end quote. Frank's sense that Hitler was trustworthy because he was authentic and sincere was common among Nazis throughout the Fuhrer's 25-year career. Germans trusted Hitler even when they knew he was lying because of his remarkable ability to persuade audiences that he was earnest. To the very end, he was seen by many Germans as sincere and authentic, even if he wasn't necessarily truthful. The same was true of fascist leaders more generally. Mussolini, Codreanu, Oswald, Franco, de Grelle, and a host of other fascist leaders or fascist aspirants claimed to be the best representatives of an authentic national character and were acknowledged as such by their adherents. Fascists' beliefs and ideologies are obviously crucial for understanding their politics, but given the mendaciousness of their behaviors and statements, it's also important to identify how they performed authenticity, irrespective of what they actually believed. The performance of authenticity, like questions of truth, fortunately for us, has been of interest to rhetoricians for millennia, at least going back to Aristotle. In the 2nd century of Common Era, Hermogenes of Tarsus developed one of the most systematic theories of persuasive authenticity. He's not actually in this picture. As far as I'm aware, there are no visual representations of Hermogenes, but this is a teacher and his students from roughly the time that Hermogenes lived. And so I figured, close enough for government work, right? Hermogenes' definition of, or his theory, I should say, of persuasive authenticity is still helpful for understanding fascist rhetoric nearly 20 centuries later. Building on the work of other classical rhetoricians, Cicero, Aristotle, Quintilian, Hermogenes contended that the appearance of authenticity was a function of speakers' performance. So in oratory, Hermogenes contended that sincerity or authenticity could be demonstrated by adopting an unaffected style, which allows a speaker to appear spontaneous, emotionally invested, animated, and candid. Hermogenes argued that prepared remarks made a speaker look calculating, whereas appearing to speak extemporaneously made a speaker look impassioned and sincere. Likewise, knowing specific details about complex policies makes a speaker look too deliberate and maybe even devious, whereas making wild, spontaneous, non-factual statements can make a speaker appear authentically overcome with passion or emotion. In the pursuit of persuasion, according to Hermogenes, a speaker is better served by being passionately wrong than expertly right. So here I will call your attention, just as I did to my audience on the 22nd, back to the beginning where I said it would be funny that I was working from a script, because basically I'm encouraging you not to be persuaded by me. I am expertly right, but not passionately wrong enough. So feel free to chuckle to yourselves, scornfully or otherwise. For Hermogenes, not having the facts was not an obstacle to persuasion. And it was even potentially a powerful way to demonstrate sincerity and authenticity that vastly exceeded performances of knowledge and proficiency. He might well have been describing the difference between Enlightenment democratic politicians, liberal Democrats, and fascist politicians 1800 years before either of those things existed. In addition to pointing us to the power of authenticity, Hermogenes also highlights the importance of public speaking in fascist politics. Powerful, sincere appearing oratory was crucial for fascist recruitment and crucial for replacing empirical truths because of the passion and the feeling, the emotion that's built into it. Fascist leaders, of course, were often notoriously powerful speakers. Historian William Carr, for instance, called Hitler, quote, one of the great orators of history, perhaps the greatest of the 20th century, end quote. See how much fun that is? It's exciting. It feels like I know what I'm talking about, even when I'm just talking off the top of my head. Mussolini and Cornelio Codreanu were also charismatic speakers, as were fascist leaders throughout Europe and North and South America. Not all of them were, but most of them were. And one final point before I wrap up. When authenticity supersedes facts as the primary basis of truth, even lying openly and egregiously can become an indicator of a leader's trustworthiness because it exhibits sincerity. Practicing open deception may seem like a strange way to appeal to people seeking truth and authenticity, but is not without a certain logic. In her 2019 book, Rhetoric and Demagoguery, Patricia Roberts Miller argues that, quote, assurances of certainty count as evidence of accuracy, because willingness to go to extremes demonstrates certainty, irrationality becomes an odd kind of evidence, end quote. So since extreme irrationality is evidence of certainty, and certainty is evidence of authenticity, and authenticity is inherently honest, then ironically, lying egregiously can be a demonstration of truthfulness. In other words, the performance of authenticity can override almost any other consideration for people who are desperate for a leader that they think is telling the truth. And under those circumstances, many candidates, even devoted Democratic candidates, are happy to oblige the demand for authenticity for obvious reasons, but obviously with potentially appalling consequences. And that brings us back to the present moment. I've spent my time today with long dead fascist leaders, but this is not an idle historical inquiry. In recent years, authoritarian, fascist, and otherwise anti-democratic movements have earned significant traction and even election to high office in some of the world's most established democracies, including France, Germany, Austria, Britain, and the US. In a number of other countries, including Turkey, Hungary, Poland, Israel, Kenya, India, the Philippines, Bolivia, and Brazil, democratically elected leaders have taken their elections as mandates to undermine or destroy democratic norms and institutions. In Russia, Venezuela, Hong Kong, Myanmar, and elsewhere, democracy has been systematically dismantled. As Sarah Churchwell and Richard Steigman Gall have demonstrated, it's not just a distant phenomenon either, and never has been. American fascism is and has long been a thriving movement. Perhaps the most famous active neo-fascist group in America is the Proud Boys, who Donald Trump name-checked in a debate with Joe Biden during the presidential campaign. The Proud Boys have been centrally involved with events like the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia in 2017, the January 6th US Capitol attack, and street fights with anti-fascist activists in Portland, Berkeley, and Modesto. In 2020, the Southern Poverty Law Center identified local Proud Boy chapters in Sacramento and Modesto. As you can see, I put these examples together based on the fact that most of the people in my audience are in California. Not to be confused with the Proud Boys, the Boogaloo Boys are a far-right extremist group whose name derives from a meme that first started in neo-Nazi and neo-fascist message boards. In 2020, one of the members, who was living in the Santa Cruz Mountains just a few miles from where I live, and an active member of the Air Force, launched deadly attacks against police in Oakland and Santa Cruz County in an effort to touch off a civil war. And then there's Identity Europa, a white nationalist, presumably defunct, neo-Nazi affiliated group associated primarily with recruitment on college campuses, including San Jose State. The founder, Nathan D'Amigo, was born and raised in San Jose. His LinkedIn account indicates that he earned his BA from Stanislaus State University. There's also Patriot Prayer in Oregon, the National Alliance in Nevada, Atomwaffen Division with chapters all over California and in fact all over the country, and the National Socialist Movement in Arizona, to name a few. We're surrounded by neo-fascists and they are recruiting in our backyards. These groups are filled with our neighbors, our colleagues, our friends, maybe even some of you who are watching this now. And for the most part, the people who are in these groups are cynical about democracy and about politicians. And they're looking for anyone who's a quote unquote honest political actor. And they're happy to believe that they're part of a chosen people and willing to go to extremes to feel like they can stop what they think of as decadence and the degradation of American culture. So while the 20th century's fascist leaders that I've been talking about today are long dead, fascism and fascist rhetoric live on, sometimes candidly, sometimes as obvious but quiet background noise. In any case, it remains an urgent task for us to understand why and how fascist movements attract, build, and sustain support from ordinary citizens and voters, without which they would wither and die. So thank you for listening today. During the original presentation, several people sent in questions and asked me to respond to them, and I just didn't have time to do it at that time. So fortunately, because of the re-recording, I have some additional time and I can talk a little bit, answer some of the questions that I wasn't able to answer on the first go round. There were somewhere in the neighborhood of 20 questions. Of those 20 questions, somewhere in the neighborhood of 8 of those questions were ably represented by this one, offered by Pamela Stacks. She writes, I appreciate your characterization of those who believe in the leader, even when the leader speaks lies boldly, especially due to the perceived passion and sincerity of the leader. I remember speaking with an SDS, Students for Democratic Society member, who in exasperation once told Dr. Stacks, you simply have to believe. So then she asked, how can those who wish to engage these followers gain traction? What forms of argumentation could be successful? So the question really at hand is, what do we do? For those of us who are committed to democracy and who want to resist or directly fight against fascist rhetoric, what do we do? The answer, I'm afraid, is not tremendously encouraging. Fascists have been recruiting for years and years and years, and for years and years and years, representatives of liberal democracy have pretended that they weren't a problem and pretended they didn't exist. We have, in general, as a culture, we have gotten really bad at standing up for and defending liberal democratic values. And there are lots of reasons that we have let that slide, but commonly the problem is that we take for granted that people want democracy. We take for granted that people will think liberal democracy is the best way to run a country. And while I believe that that is the best way we have available, it's not the case that we can take it for granted. It's not the case that everybody believes that liberal democracy is, which means the real answer to what should we do is start 50 years ago. But the slightly less idealistic or glib or unhelpful answer is the people who are persuaded by fascist rhetoric are persuaded in community. They're persuaded by people that they trust, by people that they believe in, by groups and communities of people that they feel identified with. So the best way to counter fascist rhetoric is actually to talk individually on small scale with people who you have close contacts with, communities that you can help get to know and talk to and convince over time, slowly, and with a significant amount of time and energy commitment, that fascism is not the way forward, right? I wouldn't recommend saying, hey, you're a fascist, stop being a fascist. So much as giving people who have sincere questions about how we should be living, sincere questions about the state of the world, sincere fears and sincere worries, and try to understand those sincere worries and try and talk to people about the ways to address them that don't return us to, you just got to believe, right? You just got to believe is not how liberal democracies are run. But again, that takes a lot of time and it takes a lot of effort and it takes sustained effort on lots of people's parts And I hope we are getting to a place where it's visible to people that fascist rhetoric is re-emergent and has been for many, many years, but is especially emergent at the moment. And we need to do the work to try and recommit to liberal democracy and its values. Next question. This from Matt Crockett. Do material conditions of a society make a population more or less likely to be susceptible to fascist leaders and their rhetoric? So do things like jobs, wages, economic stability, inequality, etc., make people more or less susceptible to fascist rhetoric? The answer, I think, is yes. It's not a guarantee, right? It's not a necessary consequence. But nevertheless, if people are feeling unsettled, if people are feeling nervous, if they're feeling anxious about their place in the world, it makes them more likely to find comfort in certainty, comfort in consistency. And certainty and consistency are much harder to find, in part because they're not the central values of liberal democracy. So as people feel more and more anxious, they are more susceptible to fascist rhetoric. Mauricio Curel asks, how do fascists engage in opposing lies, such as you should fear such and such a person and such and such a group, I'm sorry, and such is an inferior group capable of nothing. So how do we hold these two things? How do fascists hold these two beliefs in their minds at the same time? The way that often it happens is that fascists choose a group of people who are already vulnerable, right? So you can point to somebody, for example, in 1930s Germany, what Hitler did is he chose the Jews to pick on, right? And there was already a long history of anti-Semitism in Central Europe and hundreds of years. Even though Jews in Germany were an incredibly small part of the population in 1920s and 1930s, Hitler consistently drummed in to his speeches that they were all powerful, they were involved in Bolshevists, conspiracies to run the world, they got involved in the media, they got involved in banking, right? All of these sorts of things they're very common tropes, anti-Semitic tropes. But Jews had very little power, very little actual power in Germany on a large scale. And so he was able to more or less say what he wanted to say about them because they didn't have a whole lot of opportunity to rebut him. And so he would say they're involved in everything and there's more coming, right? There's more coming. They're consistently in charge of everything and there's more coming and we have to stop them before they get too powerful. The same is true about neo-fascist rhetoric about immigrants, right? They're coming, we should be afraid of them. They're very powerful, and also because they're inferior, you can talk about them however you want to talk about them. Because they're vulnerable, I'm sorry, you can call them inferior. So that's the way they do it. They sort of pick on a group of people that doesn't have a tremendous amount of power, that is already vulnerable, and it's much easier to define those people however you want to define them. An anonymous attendee asks, mainstream media appears to have lost its credibility for so many these days. Where do you recommend your students go for reliable and credible information? And does the fact that so many people do not subscribe to newspapers or magazines factor into this problem? That's a really good question. And it's a challenging one to answer. Number one, because there are media historians that are far more capable of answering this question than I am, and people who have studied the circulation of news far more deeply than I have. to my way of thinking, the problem is not necessarily that the mainstream media has lost its credibility. One of the challenges of both the early 20th century and now we find ourselves in this moment again is that with the proliferation of new technologies. So in the early 1900s, it's the radio in particular, and now it's social media. What the proliferation of those things means is that you can build an entire media diet on whatever you want, and you never have to encounter media that disagrees with you. So if you want to believe, for example, that a caravan of immigrants is coming up from South America to take over the country, you can find media, and you can only choose to consume media that will allow you to believe that over and over and over again. And you never have to find any media, you never have to confront any media that disagrees with that point of view. So it's less about the kinds of media that we have than it is about media, like closed media groups where you only hear what you want to hear. So actually what I tell students is they should consume lots of different points of view, lots of different arguments from lots of different types of media, in order to understand how people are using evidence, how people are making their arguments, what arguments trace to what kinds of evidence, where they seem to begin, where they originate from. I think people who are supporters of liberal democracy should be consuming media that runs full in the face of their beliefs in order to understand what people are arguing and why. How do you make people who are in a media environment where they don't have to ever confront anybody else, any other points of view? I don't know how to do that, right? That's a real challenge, but that is, I think, the problem. To the second part, does the fact that so many people do not subscribe to newspapers or magazines factor into the problem? I don't think so, because we had the same exact problem in the United States before the Civil War. People were able to be in closed media environments. They could consume newspapers, they could consume periodicals, broadsheets, that they never had to confront anybody else. So I don't think it's so much a function of the type of media as it is the ways that people access it and whether or not they can get into media that never has to change their minds. So finally, last question. This is from Chris Wary at San Diego State. He says, neo-fascism seems to intersect with authoritarianism and demagoguery. Can you say a little bit about the connections or the differences? And I could say a lot about them. In fact, I could talk a whole nother hour, but I think probably Mariah and Leslie would not appreciate it if I did. Fascism is a particular kind of political movement, right? It's politics. It's about how you organize a group of people. And authoritarianism is too. Fascism is generally based on authoritarian principles. Authoritarianism is not always fascist. So you can have communist authoritarians, you can have, theoretically, you could have democratic authoritarians. I think in Hungary, the current leader, whose name escapes me, calls himself an illiberal democrat or illiberal democracy. He's an authoritarian, even though he talks about Hungary as being a democracy. So you can have authoritarians that aren't fascists. Fascists are almost always authoritarians, just by virtue of the fact that there is one person in charge, one leader that everybody owes their allegiance to. But both of them are ways to organize politics. Demagoguery, by contrast, is a way that people argue. And there are people, again, who have done lots of work on this. I am particularly persuaded by the argument that Patricia Roberts Miller makes, which is that we are in a culture of demagoguery. So there's not one demagogue who's bad or two demagogues who are bad, but the demagoguery is how people argue, and what they argue essentially is we're in real danger. We should stop weighing evidence. It's suicide and dangerous to us if we don't combat the enemy and see the people who we disagree with as enemies. And therefore, given the fact that our opponents are treated as enemies, eventually at its extreme versions means that we're going to have to engage in some sort of violence and or eradication. So demagoguery is a way of arguing that sort of strips out not just the need for different kinds of evidence, but the value of different kinds of evidence. We should not entertain opposing point of views. We should not consider the policy, whether the policy is a good policy. We should instead just trust the people who are part of our in-group because they are like us, therefore they are good, therefore we trust them, therefore we should go along with them, therefore we should never question them, because questioning them is disloyal, and being disloyal is a good way to get yourself in the out-group, and therefore a potential target of extermination. So fascism and authoritarianism often rely on demagoguery. Demagoguery is not necessarily does not necessarily always result in authoritarianism or fascism, which are political systems. I hope that makes sense. That was a lot of things going on. I want to thank you all again for those of you who have sat through this, and for those of you who attended on the 22nd. I'm really grateful for this opportunity, and I again want to thank Leslie Sechrist and Mariah Ramsor for their efforts to make this work. And with that, I will unshare.